So welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone's managed to grab a quick bite to eat or some lunch, and you're all now back here with us for this afternoon sessions at this year's America Spectrum Management Conference. So this morning we have looked at three bands that I think have actually been covered in a number of the previous conferences that we've held in the region as well. So we looked at the C band, CBRS, and the 6 gigahertz, and all of them, as I said, have definitely been covered before, and it was interesting to get an update on where we are with all those. Next, we're going to be moving on to a band that I don't think we have looked at before. So we're going to be moving on to have a look at the 12 gigahertz band. So it's not one, as I said, that we featured before, but definitely is one that is being talked about quite a lot in the region at the moment. So really looking forward to the discussion here. And I'd like to welcome to the stage our moderator for the session to tell us more, and that's Stefan Sloan. So Stefan, welcome. Good to have you here. Good to have you with us. And yeah, as I said, we haven't actually, I don't think, ever had a session focusing specifically on 12 gigahertz before. So really looking forward to this. So pass over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. Yeah, we're as you say, continuing the arc of this conference as we work our way up the bands, and I'm mindful of Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel's advice yesterday morning when she opened the conference that we train our eyes on the horizon. And so if you have very good vision, that's exactly where you'll find non-geostationary satellites rising. And welcome to the 12 gigahertz band in today's discussion, specifically the 500 megahertz between 12.2 and 12.7 addressed in the FCC's Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that came out on January 15th. Now, if you don't know about Forum Global and you get your news from places like the Wall Street Journal, you might have seen Monday's headline that suggested that this discussion is really just a spat between billionaires. And of course, there's more to it than that. That's just a headline. And so we're very fortunate that we have Eric Graham, the Noah Campbell, and John Hunter here to help us understand this and to discuss this. And so I think it really would be appropriate to start off. Many of you know Eric Graham is a very down-to-earth guy where he serves C-Spire in a number of positions, but he now wears the title of Director, Government and Regulatory Engagement in North America for OneWeb, which is an operator of a global constellation of satellites in low Earth orbit, and they deliver high-speed, low-latency services everywhere. And so with that very modest mission, Eric, welcome. You're our incumbent here in this space. Please give us your perspective, sort of God's eye view, looking down from your constellation there.
Well, thanks, Stefan. I appreciate that. And I wish we could be in person for this panel, but hopefully we'll be able to do that again soon. OneWeb is a LEO operator, low Earth orbit satellite operator that's still in the process of completing our constellation, but an incumbent, as you said, in the 12 gigahertz band. We are focused on this 12.2 to 12.7 portion of the KU band, like other NGSO FSS operators. And in this band, we, along with a couple of other types of operators, are all co-primary, free to operate in the band, provided that we do not interfere with each other. If you back up to 2016, the 12 gigahertz band was the subject of a petition for rulemaking from some current licensees who actually still hold their licensees, most of them still do, to have mobility introduced into this band. And I know most of the discussion in this event this year has been around mobility. However, as it turns out, there are other incumbents in this band, including those like OneWeb, who are using this band as a link from satellites to user terminals based on Earth. So it's critically important that we have this band available to us. Back in January, as you noted, the FCC launched a notice of proposed rulemaking seeking to determine whether this band was being used for its highest and best purpose, and questioning whether others could be added to the band, provided that it did not cause harmful interference to the incumbents. Now, previously, when the initial request was put in to launch a notice of proposed rulemaking, the proponents of the rule put forth studies that clearly showed there could not be coexistence between mobility and incumbents in the band. And then shortly before the launch of the NPRM, another study came in claiming to show that there could be coexistence. And that's been followed by another study. And I think it all comes back to how you define coexistence. You'll hear from one of the proponents of the changes today that they've submitted the only engineering studies into the record, and it's true. And you'll hear that coexistence is possible based on this study. And that's true too, as long as coexistence is defined by not being geographically close to each other with user terminals. What you won't hear is that side-by-side user terminals between mobility and incumbents, specifically NGSO FSS user terminals, is possible, because it's not. And that's why you don't see additional studies coming in. The proponent's own study shows that the standards set by the FCC and the NPRM can't be met. You know, I came from the wireless world, did mobility for years and years, along with fiber. And at one point, I had the view that I think you'll hear from another panelist, that any spectrum band lacking mobility is necessarily fallow spectrum. But again, that's simply not the case here. There are three classes of incumbents in the band, two of whom have made business cases out of their licenses, one of whom has failed. And therefore, this is not fallow spectrum. In fact, satellite technology, NGSO FSS users, are the only option in this band and in others to provide broadband connectivity throughout every inch of America. We'll be able to do it using this as the satellite to user terminal link, and will help policymakers realize what has been a 100-year-long goal of universal connectivity for Americans everywhere. We'll do this in the US, we'll do it throughout the world. And I look forward to being on this panel, talking a little bit more with you and with the other panelists, and hearing the audience's questions. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Eric. So from the man who's the incumbent to the man who has skin in the game as well here, I introduce the Noah Campbell. He's the co-founder and CEO of RS Access, who's the second largest holder of 12 gigahertz spectrum licenses in the United States. And he's also the founder and managing member of the Radio Spectrum Group, LLC, where he advises participants in the wireless space, and he now advises us.
Thanks, Stefan. I really appreciate it. Thanks for hosting this event. Looking forward to chatting with everyone about this really important band. And I'll just go through sort of a little bit of the history of my company and history of the band. And Eric gave an overview of kind of what's been going on here as well. But I founded this company, RS Access, about 3 years ago with my partners at MSD Capital. It's a family office from Michael Dell. And the reason that we made an investment in this frequency, and this is really important too, these are licensed spectrum licenses. So my company owns 80 licenses that cover about 16% of the US population, about 25% of the US geography. And the reason that we're interested in this spectrum is because it's extremely unique. It's the only licensed spectrum that exists in the United States between 6 gigahertz and 24 gigahertz, full stop. There's no other licensed spectrum that's there. And there's a bunch of historical reasons for that. But the other thing that's really compelling about this spectrum for us and for a lot of other participants, and there's a whole coalition that does this too, right? It's not just RS Access and Dish. And and to be clear, I'm not technically one of the billionaires who's battling here. I'm just sort of working with the asset that the billionaires are battling over, apparently, according to the Wall Street Journal. But this is a lot of spectrum, right? This is 500 megahertz of spectrum. So to put that in perspective, and this is really easy for a spectrum management conference, I mean, you got an auction that's going on right now, which is 100 megahertz spectrum in 10 megahertz blocks. C-band was 280 megahertz of spectrum. So this is 500 megahertz of contiguous spectrum that you could do just amazing things with. And not only is it a lot of spectrum, but it's in a very unique position in the band. And we work very closely with Roberson and Associates. I'm sure people here know Dennis Roberson, the chair at the FCC of the TAC. And this is really compelling just from a propagation standpoint and a performance standpoint. For mobile operators, this spectrum could be very, very compelling, will be very, very compelling for mobile 5G services. So we really like the frequency for performance reasons, for just sheer depth reasons, but also from a coexistence standpoint. There are no federal users here. And federal users, as I think everybody watching this will know, really creates, having federal users in a band really creates a lot of complication, and rightly so. Right, so the band that they're auctioning today is co-located with radar systems, military radar systems. The co-location or the coexistence in our band, and actually this is really, I think, very compelling. Our band, the 12 gigahertz, 12.2 to 12.7, was really built to be a shared band. And I want to be totally clear about this. Our advocacy is not to have NGSO removed from the band. It's not to have OneWeb or SpaceX removed from the band. Our advocacy is that this band can be shared. So not having federal users, just having retail type users, and we can talk about this too. DBS is really the incumbent user here. They use it much more than NGSO users, and their DBS service is really serves tens of millions of subscribers. The other licensee here, Dish, is by far the most robust user of this frequency. So our advocacy, and we're very grateful to the FCC for opening up the NPRM here. Our advocacy is to update rules in this band that you would never, ever make considering today's technology landscape. So having 500 megahertz of spectrum and saying we're going to just use this for a low power terrestrial one-way service, we think it just reflects the time that these rules were made. And these rules were made in a 1G era. We never could have foreseen the way that devices would use frequency in the future when they made these rules. So our advocacy is to say to the commission, let's take a hard look at what can be done here from a technology standpoint. And Eric previewed it very well. My company, RS Access, has worked very, very hard. We took the FCC's mandate to us and question to us very, very seriously. And we worked with RKF Engineering, and we work with a dozen plus PhDs in RF and who do this type of work, including former FCC engineers, including bold typeface names that everybody in this, many people watching this now would know. And Eric is right. Geographic separation is really important here. But we're talking about a service that, don't take my word for it, if you listen to the SpaceX people, or you listen to the OneWeb people, or you look at the deals they make, the areas they're trying to serve, these are very, very, very rural areas. And will there be 5G services in 12 gigahertz in rural areas? Yes. Is the predominant service mobile for mobile 5G in rural areas? No. There will be fixed 5G applications, which are extremely important for rural users in this 12.2 to 12.7 band. But predominantly, we're talking about urban and rural areas where satellites, and it's not me being critical, and it's not spin, satellites they're not built to serve urban markets and GSO services. And I would also point out that the NGSO, and just to be clear, we're not advocating they're removed from the band. We're saying they can stay in the band with coexistence. The engineering proves that. But there's it's very clear that the services that they envision for that band are rural services. And I'm not saying anything negative about rural services. I live in a rural part of the country. These guys have the two NGSO services, planned services that want to use 12.2 to 12.7. Have 2,000 megahertz of spectrum just in the downlink. SpaceX has 15,500 megahertz of spectrum total to choose from. And in terms of this discussion about NGSO needing 12 gigahertz in order to provide their services, I would point out that the Amazon planned NGSO service doesn't intend to use any spectrum whatsoever in this band. So look, there's huge benefits here to opening up the band. We think it's actually, the engineering is pretty straightforward. And we're looking forward to proving it out and working with interested stakeholders to bring this frequency to 5G.
Thank you, V. And so there we have two very thoughtful and well presented perspectives here of the 12 gigahertz band. And for those of you in the audience, I'd encourage you to take that information and help us form the questions for the remainder of our session here. And while you're thinking those up, it's my pleasure to introduce John Hunter, who I know is known to so very many of you. And when he's not doing the very good work of Warriors for Wireless Scholarship Fund, he is the Senior Director of Technical and Engineering Policy at T-Mobile, where he's responsible for responding to and forming opinions about questions exactly like ours here in the 12 gigahertz band. So John, you've heard, I think, positions that you're familiar with from each of our panelists here, from V and from Eric. Where do you stand?
Yeah, I think both of them laid it out, their positions very well. I would say we're pretty much aligned, I think, with RS Access, and that the band should be made available. I think a lot of folks believe that it should. It's a sweet spot between mid-band and millimeter wave, 500 megahertz of spectrum, as Noah pointed out. To have, this spectrum support 5G going forward is just a tremendous opportunity. I could envision, 5 100 megahertz channels that would just do wonders and really provide a good shot in the arm for 5G going forward. So, others may argue whether or not we can coexist with sharing, whether that's true or not. I think the way you bring this to the fore is really through an auction. And I think that's what's before the commission today, is really to assess what is the better outcome, what's in the public's interest for this spectrum. And I certainly, as Eric, said, some would say it's fallow spectrum. I would characterize it as underutilized. It's an underutilized portion of the spectrum, and which is precisely why the commission put this out for comment. So I think us coming together here today to have a debate is certainly merits further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. And I'll pick up on your point of the underutilization and of the auction maybe, and open up the discussion to each of our panelists here. I believe in the NPRM, there's some discussion about how much the 3.5 experience transfers to the 12 gigahertz band or not. And so maybe let's hold serve here. And Eric, if you have some thoughts about how much that can inform what decisions should be made here, and then V, I'm sure you have an opinion to respond with.
Yeah, I'll respond to that. Probably not in the way that you're thinking, though. 3.5, as we heard Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel say yesterday, is actual mid-band spectrum, along with other bands that are in that same general portion of the range of frequencies available. One thing to correct that V said that was wrong is, while 12 gigahertz obviously sits between 6 gigahertz and 24 and is licensed for some terrestrial uses, maybe that's the only terrestrial licensing is what he was referring to, but there's plenty of other licensed spectrum in there as well, because we use 14 gigahertz, we use 17 gigahertz, but more than that, there's a reason that 12 gigahertz is not, or it may be the only terrestrial licensed band, and it sort of relates to 3.5 gigahertz as well, which I know is what you asked. 3GPP focuses on frequency ranges up to 6 gigahertz, and then not again until 24 gigahertz. So mobility would be unique to this band, not just in the US, but globally. It's not even prepared to be standardized. So that leads to why this band is unique or strange, depending on your perspective. And we would say it's strange as you consider other spectrum bands, because yes, it is licensed. It's licensed by lots of users. They just happen to not be terrestrial licenses other than this piece. So yeah, you do see a couple of, or at least you see one wireless operator, T-Mobile, that has expressed interest in this. But when you look at the comments in the proceeding, you also see AT&T saying no interest and no coexistence. And then you have Verizon on the sidelines, not taking a position on this. So I think perhaps the value to wireless operators is just as their spectrum, let's try to get some, versus the specific characteristics of this band of spectrum. And then one other thing that I need to correct while I've got the floor is maybe this misunderstanding that SpaceX's business plan speaks for all. OneWeb intends to have customers anywhere a customer wants to access our services, and that includes aero and maritime, which would be in urban areas, as well as anyone else who may want our services. So while SpaceX participated in RDOF and the study that has been done focuses on rural areas, it's simply not the case that satellite operators intend to ignore urban and densely populated areas.
All right. Well, I like that, and one of the things in particular that I heard there was how this spectrum is unique, and I'd argue all spectrum is unique, and that's why there's so much value here, and why there's such care being taken in how to set up the rules for using it and for making it useful. V, you've had a chance to listen there. I don't know that you've heard anything new, but what would you say about the lessons that we've learned in other parts of the band and how it might apply to 12 gigahertz?
Look, I agree with a lot of what Eric said, him pointing out that they have access to a lot of spectrum that's sub 20 gigahertz, and, however they license it or however they get access to it, they're not, when I say that it's only licensed spectrum, I mean it's terrestrially licensed spectrum, right? Because the satellite companies have access to spectrum that's not licensed, right? There's an allocation that they have. And that actually goes to a really important point here, and Eric was talking about this in his opening remarks. In 2016, the MVDDS licensees, my company wasn't involved yet, they petitioned the FCC for access to this band. I'm sorry, to expand usage of this band for 5G services. And at that point, neither OneWeb, and this is just facts, right? Neither OneWeb nor SpaceX had access to this band. They petitioned the FCC for access to this band, along with thousands of megahertz of spectrum that they have access to in other bands. And the FCC, the MVDDS licensees, were really clear about this. They said, hey, we have a first in time outstanding petition here for expanding rules. The spectrum is perfect for 5G, to John's point. And then OneWeb and SpaceX said, we like access to the band anyways. And the FCC said, that's fine. We'll give you conditional, and this is not my words, the FCC's words, conditional access to this band based on a pending petition for 5G services in the band. And recently, earlier this year, this FCC reiterated that when they gave SpaceX their third modification. They said, you are proceeding, if you decide to proceed to use this frequency, and this is in the license that OneWeb has, in the license that SpaceX has, you are, quote unquote, not my words, the FCC's words, at your own risk for developing frequency in this space. So in terms of the reliance positioning, and look, we're not advocating that they leave this band. We think they can stay in this band and they can, have the services, which are very, very rural services. And, we can have the services that we want without interfering. But just from an FCC standpoint, I think it's really important. I would also agree with Eric to point that out. I would also agree with Eric's point about the U.S. having an opportunity here to lead the world, right? The U.S. and the FCC is not subject to waiting for the ITU to do things, waiting for 3GPP to do things. And the FCC should be looking at, and this is the mandate that they have from Congress and the mandate they have, and fortunately, they're extremely good at it. And the rest of the world, there's a reason the rest of the world looks to the FCC, because the FCC is phenomenal at this. And every congressional hearing, every Senate hearing you go to, they say, we need to be creative. We need to find opportunities to use this frequency. It's very gratifying to hear John point out, from a carrier's perspective, and this is what they're saying globally. This is engineers, right? And I'm not a non-practicing attorney, which I think might be the opposite of an engineer. But what they say is we need to use 100 megahertz. We need 100 megahertz blocks. There are 5 100 megahertz blocks here. And in terms of how it performs, I totally agree with Eric again. It is very unique, right? And the way we think about, look, when I started doing this spectrum stuff 20 years ago, when I was a kid, first year law student, 2.5, which John is super familiar with, 2.5 was considered high band. They said you can't that doesn't propagate, it doesn't work. And why would anybody do a service in 2.5 gigahertz? This is like all this stuff is, and the technology is changing. I know I'm talking a lot, but the technology is changing such that it makes us easier. Spectrum is finite. We need to be really, really creative in how we approach frequency.
Thanks very much, V. And we have a question here where folks can find the details of the studies that you mentioned in your previous. Is that at RS Access? Where do they?
It's in the docket. Pull up ECFS. Look in and this is, I would encourage anybody who's watching that to pull up the docket and look at. RKF did a really comprehensive study. And look, this is another thing that Eric's point is saying about coexistence between geographic separation or CBRS systems. This is how this stuff works. It's iterative. You say, all right, if we start at this power level and we do without a CBRS type system, does this work? All right, we make all these assumptions. We didn't have to go too far, right away, making assumptions about which are very, very realistic assumptions. We found that coexistence here is very, very realistic. So it's all in the ECFS. There's an RKF study, and there's a separate study on performance of the frequency by Dennis Roberson and Associates. It's all public.
And I would notice that even if you just go to the notice of proposed rulemaking, if you're strange like me, you get a little overwhelmed trying to read some of those documents. There's over 120 inches of footnotes and references of studies there. For reference, there's barely that much of actual content if you take out all the formatting. And so while this may be Forum Global's first tackle on this slice of spectrum, clearly there's an awful lot of work that's been done here. And actually, there's been auctions in the past here in this band. Now, it was 2014 or 2015, and this is an industry, John, that changes a lot in a year, never mind in 5 or 6 or 7. But maybe is there an awareness of how your company has grown in using spectrum and changed from that time frame that makes you more engaged now than perhaps you had been at that time?
Well, I think it's an evolution of the technology, right? I think the more you go up in the Gs, I recall starting out, in 2G and 3G where, the channel sizes were much smaller. Now we're getting into 5G, as V noted, 100 megahertz channel, that would be the sweet spot for mid-band spectrum. And I kind of equate this to mid-band. Because it's right in the center of between mid and millimeter wave. And so getting access to that type of capacity and having better propagation characteristics, more so than millimeter wave, would be certainly attractive. And another point I want to make, it was touched on with Eric talking about that 3GPP hasn't studied this band. And while that may be true, but that would not preclude this 3GPP to move this effort forward to get a mobile allocation set up for this. So that certainly can happen and should not be viewed as an impediment to freeing up the band for 5G services.
Yeah, just to be clear there, certainly it can be done. The point I'm making is this is well outside of the range of the established frequency ranges for which 3GPP does work. So it's not simply throw.
So is millimeter wave.
Millimeter wave is in frequency range 2, as you well know. Everything
right, but
24 gigahertz. The difference is there is no frequency range in which 12 gigahertz is classified. And as you also know, T-Mobile in comments suggested looking at the 13 gigahertz band as well as the 17 gigahertz band.
Of course.
Those are also bands that lie outside of the established frequency ranges. 13 gigahertz, however, would have fewer incumbents to deal with and would be a much better frequency range for this. Same amount of spectrum. The only difference being you don't have licensees who would need to be compensated for their existing terrestrial licenses, and that wouldn't be useful to all the interested parties at this point.
The point here is it would not be unprecedented. That's the point I'm trying to make. It can be done. It's not a Herculean effort to get this through the standards bodies to move this effort forward. So we've done it in the past. We can do it here.
I would argue, and sorry, I hate to jump in here, but I would argue the fact that it's not currently, on the way. And look, it's just not 3GPP actually has an outstanding study I know, and that's right now, and the ITU is looking at this right now globally between 6 and 24 because. Just look back several years, everybody says sub 6, sub 6, sub 6, 24, 24. There's a lot of spectrum between 6 and 24. and I would argue that it's actually a good reason for the US and a good opportunity for the US to lead the world here, lead the world in standards, bring frequency to market faster. And that's the mandate that the FCC has from Congress. And that's what our company is trying to accomplish.
Well, and to that leadership point, are there actually use cases elsewhere on the globe for 12 gigahertz that is useful or informative?
Yeah, this band already has in 2 of the 3 ITU regions already has a co-primary mobile allocation. The fact of the matter is this frequency has been most intensely used. There's a whole bunch of history, right? But this frequency was allocated amongst a lot of other spectrum for DBS going back into the 80s. So this is originally a DBS band. So DBS services in the US are rapidly becoming legacy type services. In the rest of the world, and a lot of places in the world, DBS services are less rapidly becoming legacy because of the development of terrestrial networks there has lagged the United States. So as DBS services and as terrestrial networks become better and as DBS services become less prevalent, totally confident that those what are currently latent mobile allocations will become more relevant.
Yeah. More directly to answer your question, no, nowhere else in the world is this being pushed for terrestrial mobility. And part of that is because it's satellite, it has a satellite allocation, and other countries around the world recognize the satellite services that are coming on, which I see we had a question of when OneWeb will be providing services. Good segue into that. Yes. Beginning next month, we'll be providing services at the 50th parallel north, because that, given the way that we've launched our constellation and moved satellites into their orbits, that's where we have total coverage initially. By the middle of next year, that coverage starts heading south below the 50th parallel, and we'll cover the lower 48. And by the end of next year, we'll have total global coverage. Again, I say total global coverage. I need to asterisk that because there is one ground station that may leave us with a small gap over the Pacific until early 2023 at that point. But yeah, to answer the question that came in, we'll have that by the end of next year. And this begins 50th parallel in north, which is Alaska. It's most of Canada, excepting the portion that dips down around the Great Lakes. It's northern Europe. It's the entire Arctic region, which is obviously very strategic globally. And we're very excited about that. And then one point about the way services are developing. When this NPRM came out back in January, it cited OneWeb as having 110 satellites in orbit, which in January was true. In October, as of today, we have 322 satellites in orbit, increasing to 355 by lunchtime tomorrow, because we have another rocket going up tomorrow morning at 5:30 Eastern time. So I say that to show just how quickly things are changing with respect to this band and how quickly this band is being put to use by NGSO FSS operators who have a business plan for this. The MVDDS licensees have never had a successful business plan, and flipping the licenses can't be one now.
Well, I think your comments there bring up you sort of in a matter of course brought up a big difference. I think a lot of us are used to playing sort of a two-dimensional game here, where we think of signal propagation is impacted by foliage or buildings or terrain. And for you, maybe it's for a satellite world, it's more latitude and the deployment of your birds, because none of those terrestrial. And so finding a way for these two to work together that have those very different propagation patterns is going to be a little bit of new science.
You know, and what you bring up, Stefan, is another difference between NGSO FSS operators. Our design has a polar orbit for every one of our satellites in multiple planes. Other operators use an elliptical orbit, not a polar orbit. And so they have coverage at different latitudes at different times. Ultimately, the constellations continue to be expanded, and you do get total global coverage. But yeah, it's a little bit like talking about football and talking about football. You've got 11 players, either way you're talking about it, but sometimes one's a goalie and sometimes one's a quarterback. It's not the same thing, even though it may go by the same name and look similar in a lot of ways.
Well, we have a number of keen industry observers and participants who are sort of loading up in our questions here. And let me bring John back in because Walt Pyack asks about Dish and AT&T being compensated if call it an auction process that you would support goes forward. We have experiences in other FCC proceedings where incumbents can relinquish spectrum and get paid out for it. Is that what you're proposing here, or do you have a different idea?
Yeah, I think that's one of many, right? I mean, and first I want to say I agree with Eric. I don't think the MVDDS folks should just be allowed to change their licensing rights as a way to do that. I think this spectrum should be auctioned, and through the past we have done things via auctions that help make incumbents whole. We just did it in C-band, for instance. So there's a way to do this. It can be done, and I think the commission is wise to put this out for comment and get folks to start talking about what is the most practical and efficient use of this band to the benefit of the American public.
And there's going to be a long discussion about this, and we're totally prepared to have this discussion in terms of how the NPRM progresses. But I would point out a couple things in terms of this auction idea that's out there. Number one, to your point earlier, and this is important, the spectrum has already been auctioned, right? This is auctioned 2 FCC auctions. Many millions of dollars were paid for these licenses. The exclusive use terrestrial licenses in 2004 and 2005. So this has already been on. This band's already been auctioned. So and when you say the MVDDS licensees haven't been able to come up with a business model, and I should have talked about this a little bit earlier. So this spectrum, it's actually very similar to the spectrum that I was doing when I was a kid. The 2.5 spectrum, right? At the time, it was ITFS. It's called ITFS. An ITFS service was meant to be a wireless cable service. It was a wireless cable service, and wireless cable didn't work. So along came some innovative users and innovative companies. One company called Clearwire, started by a guy named Craig McCaw, and they said, hey, we should make some changes to the spectrum because wireless cable doesn't work, right? Regular cable works just fine. So what we should do, FCC, is you should de-interleave these channels, and you should re-interleave them so we can use them for a new service, which is a service that didn't exist at that time, which is called wireless broadband. And this is in the 1G era, right? So amazingly, in 2004 and 2005, the FCC said, oh, wireless cable didn't work before, but let's do this thing anyways. We're going to allocate the spectrum for a one-way 500 megahertz channel that goes one way. That's right. So you got 10 megahertz or 20 megahertz licenses that you can allocate however you want. 10 megahertz up, 10 megahertz down. Do anything you want with it. This you're restricted to a one-way service, and you're restricted to using 1/10 of the power that's in one handset, much less a base station antenna and a macro cell, et cetera, like that. So when you say you can't create a business model around it, it's because as soon as the spectrum was licensed, a thing came out called the iPhone, which completely changed the dynamic. It's hard to remember now how different the world was only 15, 16 years ago. This spectrum was allocated when the rules were made of it. The iPhone wasn't even imagined what such a device wasn't imagined. So to say, oh, these guys haven't been able to make a business model out is because of restrictions on the spectrum. And there's a long history that goes back 10, 20, 40, 50 years, a long time with the FCC of rationalizing frequency positions. They've done it a bunch of different times without doing an auction. They've done it, just made changes to rules that benefited other parties, including some of the parties that are on this, talking right now. So when folks say that there should be an auction here, and I understand where they're coming from, and people want to have access to frequency, the devil in that is really in the details. We should recognize this isn't like the C-band, right, where you got an allocation and sort of used and nobody paid for it. Certainly assure you that my company has paid for this spectrum. Our predecessor company paid for the spectrum. Dish has paid for the spectrum. These are terrestrial rights that exist right now.
Well, I understand that, and I also appreciate how far the antennas and radio chains have come even after the sort of beginning of the iPhone. And we have a question here I'd like to address from the audience about overlay licenses. When you have such capable equipment in the field, like John, I'm thinking of the work that was done at the end of the FCC incentive auction with T-Mobile assisting television stations. You sort of held an overlay license there and assisted broadcasters in clearing the spectrum and going forward. And so Brent Scorp asks here as well about, given that history, what are the practical obstacles? What have we learned there about holding an overlay license and how maybe that helps or it hinders migration?
Well, I think you got different incumbents in this band, right? You'd have to look at each individual case, understand what rights they have, if there's most of the NGSOs, I believe, are pretty much acting secondary to DBS. Yeah. So I think you got to look at the individual rights of each of the incumbents and then figure out what would be the most appropriate way forward and how to structure an auction.
Eric, let me call you back there because I think we may have hit a nerve with as far as priority of rights there.
Yeah, we're co-primary. We have to operate on a non-interference basis, but our technology doesn't interfere with DBS. So it's not secondary. It's co-primary, and the rules make that clear.
NIB.
So good neighbors, not a master and servant relationship there. We do have, and I want to try and address all the questions from our audience here, that the 12 gigahertz is lower than the millimeter wave that Verizon's been deploying. How is that? I think they're trying to ask about comparing ranges. How is it exponentially that it drops off for millimeter wave? There's been a lot of discussion there about frustration getting millimeter wave to work.
This is really straightforward. And look, you can go and look at the Roberson report, which is it's a public document. And actually, Stefan, your question before, I think it actually is on the RS website, which is rsawireless.com. But Dennis Roberson and his team took a really hard look at this, like a 55-page report. There's a lot of spectrum, a lot of discussion about how the spectrum performs. Just from a range standpoint, of course, it depends on topography. It depends on, the different parts of the country that have different rain fade or different fog, et cetera. But as a baseline for this versus 24 gigahertz, is 5 to 15x coverage. 5 to 15x. That means you need 5 to 15 times more sites at 24, right, the lowest millimeter wave band, than you do at 12. So it doesn't, it's not a 1x or 2x or something like that. And that's a discussion about mid-band, right? What mid-band means. And this spectrum Midband is just something that we call it. Spectrum doesn't know what it is, right? It just performs the way that it is, and it performs the way that it does related to the technology that you use to actualize it and to put it into networks. So that with the technology that we have right now, which is getting better and better, it's gotten a lot better over the last 5 or 6 years. John can probably talk that better than I can. 5 to 15x more sites at 24 versus 12.
Yeah, and I think that the difference here of what makes this band so attractive, say from mid-band in the 3 gigahertz range, right? You just don't have a lot of bandwidth, if you will. You don't, as Noah pointed out, the C-band auction is 280 megahertz. Here we're talking 500, and so that's what makes it attractive. You're going to get the benefits of more capacity, 500 megahertz, as well as getting the propagation advantages over millimeter wave. And so that's why I think this is really a sweet spot for 5G to move forward.
All right, gentlemen, they're starting to flash the hook at me here. We had a notice of proposed rulemaking in January. We had 30 days for comments, 60 days for reply comments. We're sitting here discussing this in October. If each of you wanted to, maybe starting with Eric, we'll sort of wrap up. But where do you see where we are with the process right now? And if you want to, pull out a crystal ball and look at least the next few months.
I'll decline the invitation to pull out the crystal ball, but I'll tell you where we are right now is the record is there. And compared to what was asked in the NPRM and what you see in the record, the NPRM asked, can a terrestrial mobile allocation be introduced without creating harmful interference to incumbents? And the answer is no. Unless you redefine harmful interference and coexistence, like we said before, and say NGS FSS, you're allowed to operate anywhere that mobility doesn't. And when mobility chooses to be in your space, no pun intended, out you go find somewhere else to operate. It's simply not feasible to change the frequencies that satellites work on. It's not like climbing a tower and swapping out equipment. The satellites go up, they're intended to work on certain frequencies. That's how they're engineered. That's how they work. This spectrum is unique in a number of ways. And I think as Commissioner Starks said when the NPRM came out, the timing on this, and paraphrasing here, it's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate for the MBDDS licensees who have never been able to make a business case of it, because there are uses in this band now, and the spectrum is being used for its highest and best purposes. And had this come at a different time, perhaps the outcome would have been different. But here we sit today, and if this is converted to use for terrestrial mobility, it's literally in multiple ways the rich getting richer. Coverage will be where coverage currently exists today, and nowhere new. So the spectrum is being put to its highest and best use. The public interest is being served, and if mobility needs other spectrum, as T-Mobile has noted, 13 gigahertz is a good place to look.
With that invitation, though, I'll go to V and say this might not be the first time that one man's harmful interference is another man's treasure. I think you have an answer for that.
Look, don't like I said before, and the old reading rainbow line, don't take my word for it. I encourage everybody to go look at the RKF study. It definitively, look, there's only one study here. It's incredible, right? My company's done we want to be engineering driven, we want to be science driven. Look at the study, look at the work that they've done, the engineers, not lawyers, not regulatory people. And it says it's very clear, out of 1 million users, fewer than 8,800 future users, right? I have no 10,000 or 15,000. I have no idea how many NGSO subscribers are in the United States. Fewer than 8,800 will experience any interference whatsoever. They've got 1,500 megahertz. It's right below 12.2 to 12.7. And we'll put out some. We haven't stopped working on this, by the way. We're going to put out a new study on this relatively quickly. Where I agree with Eric is the record is clear. The FCC shouldn't let this sit. The FCC should take a hard look at it. I think that they are taking a hard look at it because their mandate is to bring frequency to market. There's 440 million U.S. mobile subscribers. I don't know what the total addressable market is for satellite. Again, we're not keeping them out of kicking them out of the band. Maybe it's 500,000, maybe it's 800,000 according to Moffett and Associates. I don't know what it is. Let's take a look at it. Let's have it out. We're totally confident in our position. We're totally confident the FCC will agree with us.
All right, John, let me come to you then to to wrap this up, and given all your experience, if I could invite you for a crystal ball shot here as well for what you see.
Well, as we get into debate on the engineering studies, I would just say let's not let the facts get in the way of a good story here. I think if sharing can be proved out, which I believe, looking at the Roberson study, it appears that it can. We've worked with Roberson in the past. Then look, there should be a good opportunity. But I think that the bigger picture here is what's in the best interest of the public. How is this band being used more and most appropriate for the types of service that it can offer? And I think it's clear that the type of service that this would be best used for is 5G terrestrial services. So I'm hopeful the commission will take a hard look at this and move forward with the rulemaking to get this spectrum out to auction quickly.
Well, thank you all, gentlemen, very much. Do appreciate the discussion here. Appreciate the sponsorship of each of your companies for this forum. And if anybody out there hasn't seen the presentation from OneWeb in the side stage there, I recommend it highly. This is the 10th year of Forum Global here, and so many of the companies or your predecessors have supported things here, and that's appreciated. And also on behalf of the audience and the fine panelists here, I'd like to congratulate Forum Global on those 10 years. We've spent a lot of time here in these sessions talking about best practices, about how to tackle the present challenges and the obstacles to doing a good job. And I think that as much as any company I've worked with over the last few years, Dan and Jordan and everyone at Forum Global really has accomplished that and brought it through for us. So appreciate it very much. Virtual or distance, a round of applause for them there.
Well, Stefan, thank you very much. I really appreciate those kind words, and I think from our side, I think we really appreciate your involvement. I think must be at least 4 or 5 years now, I guess, in a row you've been involved. If
you keep inviting me, Dan, I keep coming back. I'm on my best behavior, I promise.
Well, no, we love having you part of the event. I really do appreciate your support over the years as well. So thank you, and of course, same goes to John, to Eric, and to V. I know it's the first time that you've been part of this event, but hopefully in the future, again, we can welcome you back to be part of the event again. But guys, all in all, excellent session. So thank you all so much. Really do appreciate that. Really good discussion, and I think you could see that from the number of questions we were getting from the audience as well. And I say this quite often after these sessions, but we could really have gone on for a lot longer with that. But alas, our time is up. But thank you. That really, really was an excellent session. So thank you all very much for that.
Thank you.
So we're next moving on. We're going to go straight on now, and we're going to shoot up the frequency ranges, and we're going to be looking at the millimeter wave frequencies. So next up, as I said, millimeter wave we're going to be looking at next. Don't go anywhere. It's going to be coming up here in just a couple of minutes' time. And we've heard from a number of industry representatives in this panel here. We're actually going to be switching when we go to millimeter wave, and it's going to be what we're calling a regulator's corner. So we're going to be hearing different regulatory perspectives from both within the region and also outside. So don't go anywhere. That'll be here in just about 30 seconds or so. Thank you.
Over the last 20 years, Wi-Fi has transformed the world. In Wi-Fi lands, we have worked diligently to ensure that Wi-Fi democratizes connectivity. This vibrant, energetic community of fans that we have, that includes engineers, entrepreneurs, venue owners, operators, policymakers. And with this diversity of community sharing the same interest for Wi-Fi, we can be sure that the next 20 years of Wi-Fi are going to be tremendously exciting.